Greetings, welcome back. UXUK here with another continuation of the Games I Have Played series. And today I will be talking about Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition. I will be very honest here. This is one of my favourite editions. Well, I'm actually going to say this is my favourite edition of Dungeons and Dragons. I first learnt of it back towards the end of the 1990s. I had recently found out that I had to move. My landlord wanted to sell his house, and I had to go over to the nearest council offices to try and register for a new house, put on the waiting list. And I picked up a copy of this month's Dragon magazine, and it was all about the new 3rd edition that was coming. And I sat there and I read this on the bus, and quite frankly I was horrified. Yeah, that's my horrified face. And I'm looking through this and I'm like, they're messing with my game. It was a point buy system now. There's no THAC0, it's a D20 roll plus modifiers, and you have target numbers, and I'm thinking this isn't D&D. There's only 3 saving throws now, there's not 5. And suddenly there's new classes in the game. You had Sorcerer. I think we had Monk before. We had something similar, if not Monk. My brain's not working. But I was looking through all these examples of how the game had changed in the article, and I'm just thinking, no, they're messing with it. They have completely ruined D&D. Obviously, I was very, very wrong, and I'm happy and pleased to admit that. I picked up the Player's Handbook and the introductory box set, which came out in I think it was like an orangey gold box, and it contained some fold-out map and basic rules and some little round token chit things that you could use for monsters, and a scenario. And I picked up a third-party monster manual that actually came out before the monster manual, that was called the Creature Collection, Volume 1, which was the first bestiary for the Scarred Lands campaign setting. And I read through this, and I ran the game for 2 of my friends. Neither of them are D&D players, really. One of them was Paulie was a big vampire and werewolf player, and JP was more into things like Call of Cthulhu and games along that sort of line. Neither of them were really D&Ders. And I thought these are the right people to test it on, because if they like it, that's a good thing. And so I basically ignored the scenario that was in the box set, and I ran something very similar to the 13th Warrior, if you've seen that film, except instead of being, I won't say the monsters, but I turned them into orcs, to keep it very similar, but I kept the plot. And the guys really enjoyed it, and the D20 system worked fantastically. Because where before, one of the problems I always had with 2nd edition and 1st ostensibly, is that you had this little THAC0 chart, and it was to hit armor class 0 THAC0, and so you would roll your dice and what modifier you had, and then you would check this chart, see what you'd got, and that told you which armor class you would hit, or the lowest armor class you would hit. And I tell you, half the time as a player and a GM, my head would just spin around, and I'd go, and I'd just tell people what the armor class was that they needed to hit, and then they could work out it themselves. And it made it so much easier. With 3rd edition, you didn't have that. Armor class goes up, not down. And as everything is a D20 plus modifier, it was easy. They could just say what the total was, and you as the DM knew whether you'd hit it or not, whether you'd passed a skill check or not, or a saving throw, or what have you. And that's one of the things I really like in the end with the D20 system. It was very modular. You simply rolled and you got that result. The classes were broken down a lot easier. they had abilities, and it was worth you leveling. With third edition, it was kind of awkward. In previous editions, you basically stuck to your class. You could multi-class, but generally it wasn't worth the effort. If you were in second edition, if you played something like a demi-human, you could start off as a dual or triple class, what's called multi-class character, and you would level all of your classes really, really slowly. With this one, it worked differently. That you could just, whatever level, you just took it. The problem was there were certain classes like Rogue that it was worth everybody taking one level in Rogue. So everyone would start, your fighter or your paladin or what have you, your monk would take their first level or maybe their second, and the third level would be one level of rogue, because it would give you sneak attack and evasion. And this was kind of the problem that D&D third edition had. They didn't really take into account this sort of thing, and we were never power gamers. We were never. I'm using that slightly disparagingly, but we were never the sort of people to tweak our characters. We would never sort of plot our characters out all the way through. You would level as you went and as it fit the story, and but with the D20 system, as we found out a little bit to our chagrin in our first proper campaign, you could twink this system something chronic. And that problem came about where they did a series of scenarios. It started off the Sunken City or something like that. It was a series of blue cover scenarios. I think there was about 7 or 8. And they ended with a scenario called the Bastion of Broken Souls. And I basically took all these scenarios and I turned them into a Dragonlance campaign. That was the scheme was to actually take 3 campaigns and run them one after the other as a continuation of an overarching plot. It didn't actually work out that way in the end, for various reasons. But we had our usual players for this, who had all got into D&D third edition. We've been playing since second, and we had got another chap that I had met by the nickname of Mooney. Really nice guy. He was a rules lawyer. Everything for him, the rules were written in stone, but it was a good thing. If I needed to know a rule from from somewhere that I didn't know or I couldn't find, I could ask him and he knew where it was, or he knew it off the top of his head, and it saved a lot of flipping about in the book. But he had an issue with if I needed to change anything, and as a DM sometimes you need to change things. The rules are, it says in pretty much the first page of every role-playing game you'll ever buy, it will say something along the lines of, these rules are guidelines. But to him they were set in stone, and it used to cause a little bit of problems. And with this in mind, he was a little bit of a power gamer, and he would push the character concepts. Sometimes it worked fantastically and you got some really cool characters out of it, but sometimes it went a little far, and that happened in our first ever campaign. He was playing a cleric. I can't remember if he multi-classed or not, but I think he was just a straight cleric. And at the very end of this, you've got this big bad basically ancient dragon that has fed on the souls of like unborn souls, and it's become incredibly powerful, and you basically got to destroy it so that these souls are not being absorbed by this dragon and can go to be born. And so you've got this big bad, and bear in mind the character's like 18th, 19th, 20th level at this point, and the players run in, their characters start slapping at the dragon, they're casting spells, as you expect, and Mooney's character stands there and he basically buffs himself for 2 rounds, runs in and kills the dragon in 1 hit. And it was, I hate to say it was the biggest anticlimax of any game I've ever run or played in. And I was so taken aback. I mean, these days, if that happened now, and I'm like, okay, I'll just imaginary add some hit points on and keep the fight going. But it took me by so much surprise that the campaign basically ended. Well, they ended. It was at the end, and nobody but this particular player was happy with the outcome. And I believe words were politely but strongly said, that we don't play like that. We don't, just because the game can allow you to play a character of those sort of strengths and abilities, doesn't mean we would do it. I mean, there was a reason why in second edition a lot of our games capped out at about 15th level. And while I might sound like I'm picking on this particular player, I'm not. But it's an example of where the D20 system for third edition failed, in that you could seriously, without much effort, really push the boundaries of the envelope of character power level. And once we'd gone through and gone into the 3.5, which I'll come to, we had campaigns where this particular player caused other issues. Sometimes with the character builds he had, sometimes with other stuff. But ultimately the player ended up having to leave the group. Not through the game, but it was getting that way. And for what I consider one of the best mechanical systems, especially for Dungeons and Dragons, it can cause issues. But it had the pros. I've gone through the cons there. It had the pros that it was a very easy system to learn. The D20 system is very, very simple. It's only really once you've got going with it that you kind of ran into certain areas where the system breaks down. And a lot of that was fixed with Pathfinder, which I'll come to in a video a bit later on. And some of it wasn't. And one of the things that wasn't, and was probably an even bigger issue in third, was things like grappling. Because it doesn't work. I mean, in Pathfinder, realistically, to understand accurately how grappling works, you have to have a flowchart. And I've seen them online where people have posted them up, and I kid you not, these flowcharts run over like 2 A4 pages, and it's ridiculous. I can remember back under like first and second edition, or even basic D&D, if you wanted to do something like that, you just did opposed strength checks, and whoever passed by the most was successful. I'm not even going to touch on the exact ways you do this, but you had to do things like you had to risk attacks of opportunity. You had to do your grapple check. Then they could oppose you in their turn, and they could, if they're successful, swip it so you would then grapple. So on your turn, you would, it didn't work. But for the most part, it was the best system I have seen. D20 for a fantasy role-playing game works phenomenally well. About 18 months after the game came out, obviously it had been sold from Wizards of the Coast to Hasbro, who obviously wanted their cut of the pennies, and they released 3.5, which was basically a re-release of the game, but with a lot of the errata and FAQ issues put in. But they didn't fix enough of it, and they basically charge you the same price again. And these were £20 rule books. And as a player, you can get away with the player's handbook, but most people would buy the DMG, and the GM needs the monster manual. And you could use the old ones, but it's not quite going to work if you run into new books that don't reference it properly. So it's a little bit annoying on that. One of the other issues that third edition had, and I'm going to wrap this up soon because I just noticed how long this has been going on for. One of the big issues it had was prestige classes. Prestige classes in the Dungeon Master's Guide for third edition basically said these are tools for the Dungeon Master. So these were extra specific classes. There were some in there like Horizon Walker, Hierophant. Was it Hierophant? I think it was Hierophant. Was absolutely broken in third edition. And the idea was that these were things that the GM can go, right, you have achieved these goals, you have met this criteria, you are now eligible because of what has happened in said campaign to take such and such a class. And the idea was that the GM could create prestige classes. So maybe they wanted a King's Guard, and at some point in the campaign you do something, you save the king, you are given the honorary title of King's Guard, you could take this prestige class. But it didn't stay like that, because they started releasing prestige classes in player source books, and immediately players want to play them. And most prestige classes in 3rd edition were either rubbish and not worth the effort, or they were too good or too powerful. And Hierophant was one of them, which basically allowed you to take an arcane caster, a divine caster, and once you got to, I think, 10th in 10th? Yeah, I think you were 5 and 5, then it let you level up the remaining 10 levels jointly. So you got all the spells and all the abilities of both classes as you leveled. They kept the same prestige class in Pathfinder, but they fixed it a little bit with the way they did the system. But under 3rd edition, it was a broken class, and I saw it abused to no end. 3rd edition was a breath of fresh air. I think the original D&D system had run its course. It was a good system, it was fun, it was simple, but I think by the time you get into the 2000s, I think simple is not the way to go. You need a game system that is going to be an introduction, and D&D has always been a gateway game. With something like D&D, it needs some teeth, and it needed a bit more of a mechanical push, and that's what 3rd edition gave it. The D20 system gave it, but they didn't balance it properly. There, as I've gone through in this video, and that's probably what I've spoken about most of. It was most definitely, as I keep saying, the best system I have played for the D20 system for a fantasy role-playing game. It works very, very well. But if you can't handle how some of the mechanics work, such as bonuses and what works with what, you're going to struggle with it. You need to have a little bit of a good mindset. But I would certainly say we had a lot of fun in the probably 10 years that we played it as one of the more memorable game systems. Thankfully, when Hasbro decided to go to 4th edition, one of the companies they work with, Paizo, who published Dungeon and Dragon magazines at that point, bought the system off them and created Pathfinder 1st edition, which was where, it was basically D&D 3.75, and that's where the D20 system kicked off fantastic. So when I come to that video, that will probably go on for a bit longer than this one. Unfortunately, D&D went downhill, in my opinion, with 4th edition. I've never played 4th edition. When I was working at the game store at the time, when that came out, I did sit there one day when it was dead, and I read the 4th edition rulebooks, and I went, this is an utter pile of boop, and I refused to touch it. In a way, 5th edition is kind of the same, but not as bad. I think the idea is they have taken that idea that you needed a mechanical system for experienced players, and they've gone, well, no, we want to be the intro game. And you're going to hate me for this, but it was dumbed down. 4th and 5th edition are dumbed down to the... I don't want to slate them, I don't want to slag them off, but it's frustrating to see the game system that works so well kicked back a bit. I have said to a friend's girlfriend when she runs a 5th edition campaign, which should have been this year, right? Or last year now. But when she comes to run a 5th edition game, I will play it for her benefit. And it will give me a chance to actually play it properly. But I know it's not a system or a format that I will enjoy enough that I would want to actually play it. Anyway, I've just realised I'm still waffling. This has gone to 20 minutes. I would like to know what your thoughts on D&D 3rd edition was, whether it's 3.0, 3.5. Were your experiences the same as mine? Yours might be very, very different. But I would like to see or hear video response or comments down below. And so until next time, fellow gamers, take care, good gaming.